took this photo this past June in Guanyin, China, right after I placed my passport in a plastic bag and gave it to a man who I really hoped was a Chinese airline employee. And then he drove away with my passport in an unmarked black BMW. So how in the world did I get here? I study international relations, which can get pretty dark. I regularly teach classes on things ranging from sex trafficking to nuclear weapons. So international conflict, in other words, is something that I think about on a daily basis. I had the opportunity to travel in Vietnam for a few weeks this past summer after working near Delhi. And I should say that I already had a pretty good flight story from this trip. On my way to Vietnam, I swapped seats with an Indian couple who wanted to sit next to each other. I sat down next to a man who I presumed to be Indian because pretty much everyone on this flight was Indian. I sat down, I looked at my fellow passenger, and he asked me, "Are you Russian?" Never gotten that one before. I said, "No, I'm American." And then he just started to laugh. He said, "Oh, I'm from Baghdad." Great. So I'm an American, I'm flying to Vietnam, and I study international conflict. So Ali and I exchanged pleasantries, and we settled into the flight. But what movie does this Chinese airline decide to show? American Sniper. Honest to God, I watched American Sniper on a loop while sitting next to an Iraqi and flying to Vietnam. At some point during the film, Ali leaned over, nudged me in the ribs, pointed at the screen, and said, "That's my country." Yeah, that's your country, and that's mine. So needless to say, Ali and I told the flight attendants to keep the wine coming on this flight. So, like I said, I thought I had a pretty good story from this trip already. So I spent a couple weeks in Vietnam, and then I was flying back to Delhi to catch my flight out of Asia for the summer. So a couple hours into this flight, the pilot comes on the intercom and says, "Is there a doctor or a nurse on board?" So after briefly considering raising my hand, so a PhD in political science is never the kind of doctor that anyone needs in an emergency, I started to listen to the chatter. And this plane had maybe 100 people on the flight, almost all of whom were Indian. There were 2 random Spanish guys and a handful of Chinese people on this flight, plus me, a single 20-something white girl from Alabama. So there was an elderly Indian couple on this flight, auntie and uncle as they will be known henceforth. And uncle was having trouble breathing. So are we gonna have to land the plane? Are we just gonna stick it out and make it to Delhi? We're about 4 hours into this flight, so we gotta be getting pretty close. And then the conflict began. So people were standing in the aisles of this flight. They were blocking the flight attendant's path to get through the middle of the aisle. People were starting to make jokes at the expense of the Chinese flight attendants, and so things were getting pretty uncomfortable. After about 5 hours of not hearing anything from the pilot, we finally hear that we are landing for emergency medical attention in China, in Guanyin, China. And on a plane full of businessmen who did business in China, absolutely no one knew where this was. So I was starting to get pretty nervous on this trip. So an emergency landing on a random airstrip in China was definitely not on my list of adventures that I had planned for this trip. I was gripping the seat in front of me for dear life. This landing was so turbulent that my butt was out of the seat several times as we were descending. I was starting to imagine my name and my picture going across the ticker on CNN as like the lone American who perished on this random airstrip in China. And so I glanced at the passenger sitting next to me. The middle-aged Indian man sitting next to me looked at me and asked me, "Are you married?" Gripping the seat a little bit tighter, I looked and I said, "No, I am not married." And he said, "Okay then, don't worry, we aren't going to die. You haven't lived yet." So after having saved all of us on this flight by not being married and not having lived yet, the Chinese medical staff came aboard the plane. Okay, so Auntie and Uncle are going to be evacuated off of the plane. I'm still going to make my connecting flight to London. I had 16 hours. 16 hours between when I was supposed to land in Delhi and my connecting flight to London. And then Auntie and Uncle refused to get off the plane. There were several moments where the Chinese airline staff tried to force this couple off of the plane. And in response to this, Auntie said, "If you touch my husband or me, I will charge you with, quote, murder." So I'm sure that the Chinese officials were afraid of making this an actual international incident and afraid of the reaction of the majority Indian flight. So after about 5 hours of sitting on the tarmac in a city that no one had ever heard of in the middle of the night, we finally hear that our flight had been canceled. And since I had about 5 hours to think about this, I already knew the next hurdle. I did not have a Chinese visa, so I had no legal right to be in China. So we all get off of the plane and we go stand near immigration. The handful of us without Chinese visas stand sort of in a corner, and there's lots of discussion in Chinese, and eventually we just walk on through immigration. No one looked at my passport, no one stamped anything, we just wandered on through. On the other side of immigration, we stood next to people who looked like us. The 2 Spanish guys were standing in a corner, the group of Chinese speakers were in another corner, the Indians were all standing in a corner, and I was standing next to the Indians when I realized what I badly needed in this situation: someone who spoke both English and Chinese. So I made a beeline over to the Chinese speakers and just started introducing myself. "Hi, my name is Sarah, what's your name? Hi, my name is Sarah, what's your name?" Until I started chatting with 2 native Chinese speakers who also spoke English. Simon, a Chinese guy who works for Ray-Ban, and Richard, a Taiwanese guy who also did not have a Chinese visa. And I'm sure Richard and Simon are their real names. So we eventually get on a bus and we go to this airport hotel. This is 2 or 3 in the morning. And we show up at this murder mystery hotel. So there's peeling dark wallpaper, there's these long dark corridors, there's bars over the windows, and most importantly for this story, there's no Wi-Fi. So we turn in our boarding passes at the desk and we find out that it is a double occupancy. Great. So I asked Richard and Simon what room they were in, and I wrote it on my hand for future reference. And then I ended up and shared a hotel room with my new buddy, Abhishek, a 30-something-year-old Indian businessman who had been one of the few voices of reason on this plane. So Abhishek and I lug our luggage into the hotel room. We shut the door behind us, and he looks at me and he says, "Okay, Sarah, we are going to rebook you that flight." Abhishek, who has a lovely wife and adorable daughter, and is now my Facebook friend, was waking up his secretary to search for flights for me. He was calling his wife to search for flights for me. We had 3 phones out. We had his international phone, his Indian phone, and my phone, which he was hooking up to the internet through Bluetooth. Plus, we had my laptop out and all of my flight paperwork in an attempt to rebook this flight. Unfortunately, this was China, so there was no Google, no Gmail, no Facebook, and so Abhishek and I decided that that wasn't gonna work out. We were not gonna be able to rebook that flight. Plus, we'd heard nothing from the Chinese airline, so I didn't know how long I was gonna be stuck in China. A day, 3 days, who knows? So I took a short nap in my semi-clean clothes, and I woke up to a knock at the door. At the door were several Chinese security guards, one of whom I recognized from last night. "Do you have a visa?" he asked me. "No." "Then give me your passport." So I was clearly not ready to give my passport to a random Chinese security guard in the middle of the night, because that's definitely how you end up on the TV show Locked Up Abroad. So I walked down the corridor with my passport gripped in my hand, and I knocked on Richard and Simon's door. Richard spoke with the Chinese security guard, and he said, "Look, Sarah, this is not a drill. We have to give them our passports." So with my passport in my hands, I looked at the Chinese security guard and I said, "Please, please, bring me back my passport. I don't want to be stuck here." And even though I don't think my words translated, I'm pretty sure my facial expression did. So I put my passport in a plastic bag, and then our favorite security guard drove away with it in the aforementioned black BMW. So at this point, I was pretty sure that I would be stuck in China for several days. They were probably taking our passports to some bureaucrat's office that was closed on Sunday, and we were going to be unable to get on a plane until we had proper documentation, plus our passports back. Couple hours later, security guard comes into the hotel lobby and says, "All of you people without visas, get on the bus." So we drag our luggage onto the bus, and we find out we're going to the airport. We still don't have our passports or have any idea when we're leaving. Eventually, someone comes out from a back room with the plastic bag and the passports. Richard and I got ours first, and absolutely nothing had been done to them. So there's no record of me actually being in China for those hours. The boarding pass actually says Guangzhou to Delhi, not the middle of nowhere airport where we were to Delhi. That flight simply doesn't exist. So we met up with our passengers who had Chinese visas and boarded the plane. The airline had given the American lady a full row of seats, so I slept on this flight because I knew that my adventure was still not over, because I still needed to rebook my flight from Delhi to London. One of the joys of the Delhi airport is that you cannot get into the airport without a valid itinerary. I've run into this problem before, so I had printed off multiple copies of my itinerary because I am no novice with bureaucrats or security guards. I said goodbye to Richard, Abhishek, and Simon. I got into the escalator line to rebook my flight, and I showed my itinerary to the security guard. And he said, "I'm sorry, ma'am, but this is not a valid itinerary. Your flight left yesterday, so I cannot let you into the airport." And I said, Yes, I know. I even have this document here that shows that my flight was canceled." "Sorry, ma'am, I cannot let you into the airport. Your flight was delayed. You don't have a valid itinerary." So let's have a recap here. I am alone outside of the Delhi airport in the middle of the night. My family thinks I'm on my way to London. I do not have a working phone, and I have yet to rebook my flight. So while begging with the Jet Airways counter, Delta, by the way, does not answer their phones on Sundays in India, I met up with two of my fellow passengers, Manish and his dad, who were in the same predicament. After borrowing Manish's phone to call a few airport hotels to try to find a room for the night, none of them had a vacancy, Manish looked at me and said, "Sarah, do you have a place to stay?" I said, "Nope, don't have a place to stay." And he said, "My brother-in-law is coming to pick up my dad and I. We will take you to a hotel. I don't want you getting into a cab this late at night, and I'm not just gonna leave you outside of the Delhi airport at midnight." And so that's how I got into a cab with 3 random strangers and my luggage in Delhi at about 1 a.m. So after being safely delivered to the hotel, I damn near wept with exhaustion. After running through all of the normal routines, so the airline, the travel agent, my best friend Casey saves the day. So coordinated through only somewhat coherent messages over GChat, Casey was able to rebook my flight at a price tag just shy of $1,000 for the very next day. So throughout those 40 hours on the other side of the planet, the lingua franca was my own. I enjoyed the luxury of having $1,000 to move around to get me back home and the opportunity to travel in the first place. There is comfort in the normal. Planes normally land on time, travel agents normally answer their phone, Gmail is normally accessible, we normally chit-chat with the strangers on a plane, and then we forget about it. But on this flight in which everything seemed to be going wrong, the kindness of strangers provided comfort at every step of the way. Manish was under no obligation to either give me a ride or patiently wait until I had checked into the hotel. I offered Abhishek nothing in return for racking up charges on his international phone. Richard certainly didn't need to offer me the last of his Taiwanese snacks that he had stashed at the bottom of his bag. And I certainly did not deserve Ali's kind-hearted conversation while we tried to avoid watching Bradley Cooper a few feet from our heads. The kindness of strangers without any expectation or even the possibility of returning the favor gives me comfort that the world is a much brighter place than it often seems. There are good people everywhere, whether in Delhi at midnight, in a murder mystery hotel room, or watching American Sniper at 25,000 feet. Thank you.